The security guard's secret. How a night worker. Quietly built. Real wealth. A story about invisible wealth and the quiet path to freedom. Part 1. The weight of a mop. It was 2:47 in the morning when Claudio pushed his cleaning cart around the corner of the 42nd floor hallway. The building was a tower of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost before most people had eaten breakfast. At this hour, the marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the ventilation system and the quiet squeak of Claudio's wheels moving slowly across the tiles. He had been working this shift for 9 years. He knew every corner of this building like a man knows the lines on his own hand. Claudio was 41 years old, and there were mornings, or rather, nights, when he felt every single one of those years in his bones. His back ached from bending, his feet were always tired, his hands, rough and calloused, gripped the mop with a kind of automatic muscle memory that required almost no thought at all. The mind, when the body is tired enough, tends to drift, and Claudio's mind drifted often, to bills that waited for him at home, to a daughter in school who needed new shoes, to a car that made a sound every morning that he hoped was nothing serious. He was a man quietly carrying the ordinary weight of an ordinary life, and he carried it without complaint, because that was simply what was required. He liked the silence of the late-night building, even if that silence was sometimes a reminder of how invisible a person can become at the wrong hour of the day. During business hours, this floor buzzed with energy, analysts on phones, assistants rushing between offices, the important clatter of important people doing important things. But now, at nearly 3 in the morning, the whole floor belonged to Claudio. In a strange way, he found peace in that. He moved between the offices and the break rooms and the glass-walled conference spaces like a ghost tending to a world that didn't know he existed. He had learned long ago not to take that personally. It was simply the nature of the work. He was mopping near the executive elevator bank when he heard the voices. At first he thought he had imagined them, a trick of the ventilation, sound traveling down from some other floor. But no. 2 men stepped out of the elevator, deep in conversation, their expensive shoes clicking sharply against the marble. They were dressed for the end of a very long evening, loosened ties, jackets slightly rumpled, the look of men who had been in a high-pressure meeting that had not ended the way they wanted. Claudio stepped back against the wall without thinking, mop in hand, as natural and unnoticed as a piece of furniture. The taller of the 2 men, grey at his temples, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Claudio's car, was speaking in a voice tight with frustration. "I don't want to hear about recovery timelines," he said. "I lost $120,000 this week, 120, because of a 2-point drop in a sector I was overexposed in." He ran a hand through his hair. The other man made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a sympathetic murmur. "It's a correction," the second man said. "It always comes back." "That's not the point," the first man snapped. "The point is it's gone. Right now. Tonight. It's just gone." Claudio didn't move. He stood with the mop handle in both hands and listened to 2 men argue about a sum of money that he could not entirely picture. $120,000. He let the number settle in his mind, turning it slowly, the way you might turn a heavy stone. It was more than he had earned in the last 4 years combined, more than twice what he would make this entire year, even if he worked every single shift without a day off. And this man was speaking about it the way Claudio might speak about a lost parking ticket, with frustration, yes, but also with the casual confidence that the inconvenience was temporary, that it would be resolved, that life would continue undisturbed. He didn't lose his sleep, he didn't lose his home, he lost what most people never have to begin with, and he expected it back by Tuesday. The 2 executives moved on, their voices fading around the corner toward the conference room. Claudio stood still for a long moment after they were gone. The marble floor around him gleamed, the ventilation hummed. He looked down at the mop in his hands, and for a moment something shifted in his chest. Not bitterness exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of quiet ache that comes from seeing clearly a distance you cannot easily measure. He was not jealous. Jealousy implies wanting what another person has. What Claudio felt was more like confusion. How had the world arranged itself so thoroughly that some people could lose in a single week what others worked years to earn? And what did that mean for a man like him? Part 2. The Man in the Park. He finished his shift at 4:15 in the morning. He clocked out, changed his shoes in the locker room, and walked out into the cool darkness of the pre-dawn city. The streets were almost empty at this hour, just the occasional taxi drifting past, a delivery truck unloading somewhere down the block, the distant sound of the city beginning its earliest preparations for the day ahead. Claudio didn't take the bus home immediately. He rarely did. There was a small park 2 blocks from the building, a narrow strip of green between 2 rows of older apartment buildings, and he had fallen into the habit of sitting there for a while before making the journey home. He needed the transition. The shift from the polished silence of the financial tower to the cramped warmth of his apartment required some kind of middle space, a place to breathe between one life and the other. He sat on a bench near the edge of the park, under the sparse canopy of a tree that was just beginning to bud with early spring leaves. The bench was cold through his jacket. He pulled his collar up and looked at the sky, which had begun to turn from black to a deep, bruised blue at the eastern edge. He was thinking about the number again. $120,000, lost in a week. He was thinking about his daughter's shoes. He was thinking about the sound his car made. He was thinking about a future that seemed, no matter how hard he worked, to remain exactly the same distance away from him, like a horizon that moves as you walk toward it. Cold night to be thinking that hard. The voice came from the other end of the bench. Claudio turned, startled. He hadn't heard anyone sit down. But there was a man at the far end of the bench. Older, perhaps in his early 70s, dressed in the dark uniform of a security guard. The man had a thermos in one hand and a calm, unhurried expression on his face, the kind of face that had been shaped by a long life into something patient and steady. He was looking not at Claudio, but at the sky, which was continuing its slow transformation from dark to deep blue to the faintest suggestion of gold at the edges. Claudio almost said nothing. He was tired, and the night had already given him more to think about than he was ready to process. But something about the old man's stillness was disarming. "Just thinking," Claudio said. The old man nodded, as if this were a perfectly satisfactory answer. He unscrewed the top of his thermos and poured a small cup of something that steamed gently in the cold air. He didn't offer any. He simply held his cup and continued looking at the sky. "I used to sit here and think too," he said, after a long pause, "for about 30 years, actually. Different bench. Same park." He smiled faintly. "City changes. Parks stay mostly the same." "You work nearby?" Claudio asked. The old man gestured vaguely back in the direction of a large office building across the street. "Night security. Have been for a long time. Different buildings over the years, but always nights. Always quiet." He took a slow sip from his cup. "I like the quiet. Things are more honest at night, I think. You can see what things actually are without all the noise in the way." Claudio looked at the man for a moment. There was something about him, a quality of settled contentment that seemed incongruent with the hour, with the cold, with the worn fabric of his uniform. Most people who were awake at 4 in the morning looked like they were surviving something. This man looked like he was exactly where he had chosen to be. "You don't mind it?" Claudio said. "Working nights your whole life?" The old man considered this. "I minded it at first," he said honestly. "When you're young, you want to be part of what the daytime people are doing. You feel like you're missing the party." He paused. "But the party isn't always what it looks like from the outside, and the quiet has its own gifts if you learn to use them." He looked at Claudio then for the first time directly. His eyes were dark and clear. "I earned less than most people I knew my entire working life," he said. "But my investments now pay me every single month, have for years. I stopped needing a paycheck to survive a long time ago." Claudio stared at him. The words landed with a strange weight, like something dropped from a height. He thought of the executive in the building, the loosened tie, the frustrated voice, the $120,000 gone in a week. And he looked at this quiet old man in a security guard's uniform, sitting on a cold park bench with a thermos, and he felt as though the world had just very gently rearranged itself around him. I earned less than most people I knew my entire working life, but my investments now pay me every month. Part 3. The Education. That schools never gave his name was Ernesto. He had grown up poor, genuinely poor, not the soft kind of poor that means no vacation, but the hard kind that means no certainty about tomorrow. He had worked since he was 14. He had never owned a home until he was in his 50s. He had never earned a salary that anyone in that financial tower would have considered significant. And yet, somewhere in his mid-40s, something had changed. Not his income, but his understanding of what money actually was and how it actually moved in the world. The problem, Ernesto said, is that most people are taught to think of money as something you earn and then spend. You work, you get paid, you pay your bills, you maybe save a little if there's anything left. And then, next month, you do it again. He turned the cup slowly in his hands. That's not building anything, that's just staying in place. You're on a treadmill, moving as fast as you can, and the scenery never changes. Claudio nodded slowly. The description was uncomfortably accurate. So what's the alternative? He asked. Ernesto looked at the sky. The gold at the edges was deepening now. Seeds, he said simply. The alternative is seeds. You have to stop eating every single thing you earn, and you have to start planting some of it. Not a lot. You don't need a lot to start, but something, consistently, without stopping, and then you wait. He paused. Most people don't wait. That's the thing. The waiting is the hardest part, and most people give up during the waiting, which is exactly when the magic is about to start. A tree, Claudio said, half to himself. He was thinking of the budding branches above them. You mean, like a tree? Ernesto looked at him with something like approval. Exactly like a tree, he said. Plant it, water it, leave it alone. Don't dig it up because you're impatient, or because someone told you there's a better tree to plant somewhere else, or because you decided you need the wood right now. You leave it alone, and it grows. And after enough years, it gives you shade and fruit, and it keeps growing even while you sleep. Income feeds your life today. Assets feed your life tomorrow. The wealthy know both. The free know which one matters more. Over the next hour, as the sky slowly lightened around them and the first birds began their early conversations in the branches above, Ernesto talked, and Claudio listened. He talked about the 3 habits he had observed in people who remained financially stuck, no matter how much they earned. He had seen it in co-workers, in neighbors, in his own family members, a pattern so consistent that it had begun to look less like bad luck and more like a set of invisible rules that people followed without knowing they had agreed to them. The first habit was what Ernesto called lifestyle expansion. Every time a person earns more money, he said, the first instinct is to spend more money. You get a raise, you upgrade your apartment, you get a bonus, you buy a better car. Your income grows and your expenses grow right alongside it, sometimes faster. He shook his head slowly. This is the cruelest trick. People believe they're succeeding because their life looks more expensive. But if you spend everything you earn, no matter how much you earn, you are exactly as financially fragile as you were before. The number gets bigger. The freedom stays the same. I've done that, Claudio said quietly. He thought of the television he had bought 2 years ago when he picked up an extra route. He thought of the dinners out, the small upgrades, the ways he had rewarded himself for working harder, and how his bank account had somehow remained just as thin as ever. I thought I was being good to myself. You were, Ernesto said gently. There's nothing wrong with enjoying more when you earn more. The question is the proportion. The question is whether any of that extra earning is going to work for you, or whether all of it is going to disappear into today. He poured a little more from his thermos. Today will always spend everything you give it. You have to protect the future from the appetite of today. Today will always spend everything you give it. You have to protect the future from the appetite of today. The second habit was social display. Ernesto described it carefully, without contempt, because he had done it himself when he was younger and he understood the pull of it. We live in a world, he said, that judges people by what they can be seen to have. The car you drive, the watch on your wrist, the neighborhood you can say you live in. And so people spend money not on things that build their lives, but on things that build their image. They go into debt for appearances. They sacrifice their future for a story they want other people to believe about them. Claudio thought of colleagues who dressed sharply but couldn't cover an unexpected bill. He thought of people he knew who talked about money constantly but seemed to have none of it. He thought of the executive upstairs with the expensive watch, frustrated about $120,000, and he wondered whether the watch was part of a wealth that was real or part of an image that needed maintaining. He was beginning to understand that these were not always the same thing. Rich lifestyles are loud, Ernesto said. Real wealth is silent. The loudest people at a party are usually not the ones with the most freedom. The ones with the most freedom are usually the quiet ones. They have nothing to prove because they've already built something that works without an audience. Rich lifestyles are loud. Real wealth is silent. The loudest people at the party are often the ones with the least freedom. The third habit was the one that Ernesto seemed to feel most strongly about, and it was perhaps the simplest and most devastating: waiting for the perfect moment. People tell themselves they'll start investing when they have more money, he said, when the debt is paid off, when the children are older, when things settle down, when the timing is right. He looked at Claudio directly. The timing is never right. There is no perfect moment. There is only the moment you decide to begin, and every month you delay is a month of growth that you will never get back. He explained what he meant in numbers so simple that Claudio felt a small shock of recognition. The sensation of understanding something that had been sitting just outside your reach for years and has finally moved close enough to touch. If you invest a small amount every month, Ernesto said, starting early, and you leave it alone, time does something remarkable to it. The money earns money, and then that money earns money, and it compounds layer upon layer until the original amount you invested becomes almost irrelevant compared to what it has grown into. He paused. But this only works if you start, and it works best if you start early. Every year you wait is a branch you won't have on the tree. Every year you wait is a branch you will never have on the tree. Start small. Start now. The tree doesn't care about the size of the seed. Part 4. The morning Claudio changed. The sun had cleared the rooftops by the time their conversation reached its natural end. The park around them had come alive, pigeons on the path, the sound of a distant bus, a woman in athletic clothes jogging past without looking at them. The city had resumed its daytime identity, loud and purposeful, indifferent to the quiet conversation that had just taken place on a cold bench between two men who cleaned and guarded the spaces where others made their fortunes. Ernesto stood up slowly, capping his thermos. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't offer Claudio a dramatic farewell or a list of instructions. He simply nodded, the way you nod at someone you respect, and said, "Think about the tree." And then he walked away, back across the street toward the building he guarded, and was gone. Claudio sat on the bench alone for a long time. Around him, the spring morning continued its quiet business, the birds, the joggers, the gradual warming of the air. He thought about Ernesto's words, turning them the way he had turned the number earlier, slowly, from different angles, looking for the shape of them. He thought about seeds and trees and patience. He thought about the distance between income and freedom. He thought about the executive who had lost $120,000 and expected it back, and he thought about the security guard who had built something quiet and solid on a salary smaller than Claudio's own. And he thought, what is actually stopping me? The answer, when it came, was uncomfortable in its honesty, not lack of income, not lack of time. What was stopping him was a set of habits so familiar they felt like facts. The habit of spending what he earned because that was what you did when you earned it. The habit of upgrading his life when his income grew because he deserved it. The habit of waiting for the moment when things would be easier, when the debt would be smaller, when the math would finally add up. None of these habits were malicious. None of them were stupid. They were simply human. But they were, all three of them, quietly keeping him exactly where he was. He pulled out his phone and looked at his bank account. Then he looked at his expenses from the last 3 months. Then he sat with what he saw. It wasn't devastating. He was not in ruin. But the pattern was clear. Money arrived, money departed, and the distance between the two was always razor thin. He had been living at the edge of what he earned for 9 years, and 9 years had passed, and the edge had not moved. He was still exactly there. The distance between where you are and where you want to be is not made of years. It is made of habits. Change the habits. The years will take care of themselves. That morning, Claudio did not make any grand gestures. He did not open a brokerage account or transfer his life savings or call a financial advisor. He did something much smaller and, in the long run, much more significant. He sat on that bench in the spring morning light and he made a decision. Not a loud decision. Not the kind you announce to anyone or celebrate with a purchase or mark with a ceremony. A quiet decision. The kind of decision that looks from the outside like nothing at all, but changes the trajectory of everything. He decided to start. Small, imperfect, and immediately. Part 5. The Seeds. The first month was not impressive. Claudio set aside $40 from his paycheck. $40. Barely enough for a modest dinner out, certainly not enough to change anyone's financial situation overnight. He put it in a small investment account he opened on his phone one evening after his shift, using an app he had researched carefully for 2 weeks before committing. The process was simple and slightly anticlimactic. He transferred $40. The account balance showed $40. He went to sleep, but something had happened. Something small and invisible and genuinely important. A seed had been planted. And unlike the money that disappeared into his expenses every month, money that was gone completely, leaving no trace behind, this $40 was the next morning, still there the morning after that. It was not growing noticeably. It was not transforming his life, but it was there, and it was his, and it was working for him in a way that the rest of his money never had. He found himself checking the balance with a feeling he hadn't expected, something like affection. Something like the feeling you get when you water a plant and watch it hold its green. The second habit he changed was the one he found hardest: resisting unnecessary purchases. Not all purchases. Claudio was not interested in becoming a monk. He still bought things he needed, still allowed himself small pleasures, still maintained the ordinary comfort of his life. But he began to pause before purchases in a way he never had before. He began asking a question that Ernesto had not explicitly given him, but that he had arrived at himself after enough thinking. Is this feeding today or planting tomorrow? The answer didn't always lead to the same choice. Sometimes he bought the thing. But sometimes, surprisingly often in fact, he found that the impulse dissolved when he looked at it directly, that the wanting had been automatic, and the thing itself was never something he truly needed. He began to see the advertisements that surrounded him differently. The billboards, the social media feeds, the conversations with friends who showed off new purchases. He saw them now, not just as offers, but as arguments for a certain way of living, a certain set of priorities, a certain definition of the good life. And he found, quietly, that he was no longer entirely persuaded by those arguments. He was beginning to build his own definition. It was simpler and less visible and more his own. Money grows best when nobody is watching, not because it is secret, but because it is patient, and patience requires silence. 6 months in, Claudio had saved and invested just over $300. By any standard of the financial world, this was nothing. It would not impress anyone. It would not make a headline. It would not have interested a single person at the financial tower where he worked. But to Claudio, it represented something that money alone could not capture. Proof that he was capable of change. Proof that the pattern was not fixed. Proof that the future was not simply going to be a longer version of the past. $300 was not wealth, but it was different from zero in a way that went beyond arithmetic. He began to read, not books that promised quick results or secret systems. Those had always felt wrong to him, the way a deal that is too good always feels wrong. He read carefully about how money actually worked over time, about the difference between an asset and an expense, about the quiet mathematics of compounding, which did not create wealth quickly, but created it reliably, with a patience that rewarded patience in return. He read about people who had built security on modest incomes, not through genius or luck, but through consistency so undramatic that most people overlooked it entirely. He found these stories more inspiring than any tale of overnight success, because they were true and they were possible, and they looked like his own life. Part 6. The tree grows quietly. Time passed. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of time passing that resolves everything neatly. Real time, which is slower and quieter, and full of ordinary days. Claudio worked his shifts. He raised his daughter. He dealt with the car, which eventually needed a repair he had saved enough to cover without borrowing. He took on an extra shift occasionally, and when he did, he increased what he set aside proportionally, following a rule he had made for himself. When income rises, the savings rate rises before the lifestyle does. A small discipline, an invisible one, but consistent. 2 years after the morning in the park, his investment account held just over $4,000. It was not a fortune, but it had grown on its own, not just from what he put in, but from the returns themselves, small at first, then building on each other, exactly as Ernesto had described. He watched this with a quiet fascination, the way you watch a plant that has pushed through soil for the first time. There was something almost organic about it. The money was doing something on its own, in the dark, without his constant attention. It was becoming, slowly, a second engine in his life. He met Ernesto once more on a cold morning 2 winters after their first conversation in the same park on the same bench. The old man remembered him. They talked for a while, and Claudio told him where he was. Ernesto listened without interruption, and when Claudio finished, the old man nodded once, slowly, and said, "You understand now. Most people never understand. They spend their whole lives very busy with money, without ever learning what it actually does." He looked at the bare winter branches above them. "The tree doesn't look like much in February," he said. "Come back in 20 years. The tree doesn't look like much in February, but it is growing in the dark and the cold, in ways that February cannot see. Come back in 20 years. 5 years after the morning in the park, Claudio's daughter started at a community college. He paid the first semester's tuition without taking a loan, from money he had set aside specifically for that purpose. A quiet, private victory that no one outside his family knew about, and that meant more to him than anything he had ever purchased. He stood outside the college on her first day, watching her walk through the entrance with her bag on her shoulder, and he thought of a security guard on a park bench in the early morning, and he thought of seeds, and he felt something that he could only describe as the particular piece of a person who has kept a promise to themselves. 10 years after that morning, Claudio was 51. His daughter had finished college and was working. His investment accounts had grown, through consistency and time and the quiet mathematics of compounding, into something he still found slightly astonishing when he looked at the balance, not because it was enormous, but because he had built it on an ordinary salary, through nothing more than patience and the discipline to keep planting when the harvest was far away. He had not become rich in the way the executives in the tower were rich. He did not own a second home or drive an expensive car or wear a watch that told people what he was worth. But he had something that those executives, with their $120,000 losses and their all-night arguments and their faces tight with the constant pressure of maintaining a position, did not always seem to have. He had quiet. Not the quiet of the late-night building, which was just the absence of people. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of a person who is not afraid. The quiet of a person who knows, with a deep and unhurried certainty, that the ground beneath them is solid. That even if the paycheck stopped, the tree would still be growing. That the machine he had built, slowly and without fanfare, in the small hours of many ordinary mornings, was working while he slept. Financial freedom is not a destination you arrive at. It is a machine you build, piece by piece, in the quiet spaces of an ordinary life. And once it is built, it works while you sleep. Part 7. What the Park Bench Taught. There is a version of this story that most of the world tells itself. A version in which wealth belongs to the talented, the educated, the lucky, the bold. In which the financial tower and the park bench are separated by a distance that cannot be crossed on a janitor's salary, no matter what choices he makes. In which the numbers are simply against certain people from the beginning. And the wise thing is to accept this and find your comfort where you can. Claudio had believed something like this version for most of his adult life, not cynically. He was not a bitter man, but practically. The math seemed to point in one direction, and he had arranged his expectations accordingly. And then, one early morning in a small park, between 2 rows of apartment buildings, A quiet old man in a security guard's uniform had said something that unlocked a door Claudio didn't know was there. The door was not to a different income. It was to a different understanding. The understanding that income and wealth are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is not closed by earning more, but by thinking differently about what you do with what you earn. That the real competition in financial life is not between rich and poor, or educated and uneducated, or lucky and unlucky. It is between the person you are today, who wants everything now, and the person you are choosing to become, who is willing to wait for something that lasts. The executives in the tower were not Claudio's enemies or his betters. They were simply people running a different race, by different rules, toward a different finish line, and sometimes losing in ways that were spectacular and loud and visible, because the race they were running had those kinds of losses built into it. Claudio had chosen a quieter race, a longer one that didn't make headlines or impress anyone at dinner parties, but one that, if you stayed in it and kept planting, and refused to give up during the long winters when the branches looked bare, one that arrived eventually at a place that felt like peace. Most people try to look rich. Few people learn how to become free. The difference between those two choices is not talent or luck or income. It is time and patience, and the willingness to plant seeds in the dark. Claudio never became a millionaire. He never ran a company or made headlines or drove a car that turned heads on the highway. He raised a daughter who was proud of him. He paid his debts without shame. He retired with dignity, a word that matters more than most financial articles suggest, because dignity is what you have when you are not afraid, and not afraid is something money can buy if you are patient enough and wise enough about what you do with the money you have. He sat eventually in a quieter version of that park bench, older, easier in his body, with more time than he had ever had. And he watched the morning light move through the leaves of a tree that had been very small once, and he was content. And somewhere, on another cold early morning, on another bench in another park, perhaps a tired man sat down beside a quiet security guard and heard the words that would unlock his own door. The words are simple. They have always been simple. They are only ever waiting for someone patient enough to hear them. The seed doesn't argue with the soil. It doesn't demand a better season or a bigger field. It does the only thing it knows how to do. It grows. Be the seed, trust the soil, and never stop planting.